when I got on video game TikTok, it was like the most harrowing like week of my life. It was just like clips of like, oh, look at this, it's crazy, and then screaming, and I was like, oh my gosh, I can't do it.
Yeah. There's like one of the things that I was getting fed constantly recently was the like people being mad that Spider-Man didn't win the Game Awards. And it's like, how did I get to this part of TikTok? Like, this is just like not my people. Like, what is going on? And anyways, the in with the like in tomorrow, it's like they're like dipping their toes a little bit into like they're like acknowledging that games that don't take themselves seriously exist, but like only a little bit. Like mostly it's about games that like um that are like attempting to like move people one way or the other, even though they're sort of like inspired by those other kinds of games. Um, yeah, like the sort of like art game, um, or serious games. It's like not even a term that people use anymore, but like that those kinds of games to a certain degree.
Yeah, oh, what was I gonna say? Yeah, that's part of the reason I say it's like in the games and the literary world, like the literary world specifically, not just books, but it's like I feel like the depiction of like two people, their artistic connection, all their emotion, it's something that people who like literature love to read. They're like, "Ah, yes, like there's so many thoughts in our heads. We're so artsy. We have all these connections and like, I don't know, we're so heady and emotional at the same time." So it's like very much I think it's yeah, funny that you say that because I feel like it very much appeals to like a certain type of reader, not just type in the sense that like I'm writing a bunch of people off, which maybe I am, but like type as in like there is a sort of market, not in a super capitalistic sense, but there's an audience for people who or for this type of depiction of the endeavor of art and the way that art connects people. I also thought of something else, which is like this is something I've been thinking about in my personal life. So like in my job by day, my full-time job, we do client work. And so some group will come in, it could be, a museum or a nonprofit or a school or something, and they'll ask us to make a bunch of games for them. And it's very specific. It'll be like we make learning games, so it's very much like make a game that teaches um how to shave. And then we make that game. And it's interesting because it is a creative position, especially the way being a designer is structured at my company. Again, I'm not technical. I don't really go in engine. Um, so it is very creative. It's a lot of like thinking of things, coming up with things, making sure things work together, which is also a creative endeavor that people tend to overlook. But it's very much a, a position of craftsmanship and not a position of artistry. It's very much like we're asking you to make essentially a tool for a specific purpose. And yeah, you got to figure out the best way to make it rather than
Hmm.
artistry, which I would say is like trying to express something and everything serves the expression rather than everything serving this sort of other purpose that is unrelated to expression. And it's interesting because, like, I think the book kind of depicts their endeavor into games as a work of passion. And I feel I would categorize the games industry as an industry of passion. It's like there's so many people who want to go into it because they care about games, they like playing games or making games. Um, which kind of makes sense because if you're someone like an engineer, you would be making a lot more money not in games. So there's like a degree to
Mm.
which it is video games are an industry of passion. But yeah, at the same time, even if I were working for a sort of more um art like a less focused but still like pretty standard type of studio, I think I would still be very much a crafts person. And so I get this kind of conflict where I'm like, I still want to make games in my spare time, even though I do that all day, because I want to express something. But Eli, I kind of want to turn it to you, and I'm curious to hear more about like your relationship with being someone who makes games and how that fits into your life, and whether you see it as an artistic thing or sort of crafts thing.
Yeah, it's interesting that you frame it in that way because I would generally consider the games that I make as artistic. I definitely am only in it as a hobby. Like it is 100% just hobbyist. Like I do it because it's fun or it's interesting. Like I'm not doing it to pay the bills at all. But then the second that you framed it as like doing it as a craftsman, like to accomplish this purpose, or doing it for passion to like express something. And in my mind, it's so easy for those two to kind of overlap. And I think back about like some of the games that I've designed, and they've all been like tabletop role playing games. But in just thinking about it, that it's like, where did those ideas start? Because I think that all of them by the end have purposes that kind of play out as you play the game. Like the game has an arc to it. There is an quote unquote like intended experience to have while playing it, but also simultaneously they all express things by the nature of their design. And so I feel like those two pieces get interwoven for me in just the my process as I operate.
Hmm.
It's
Yeah.
kind of interesting because it's like I'm thinking about I have a game that's about Antarctic exploration at the start of the 20th century. And so it's like kind of the purpose of the game in some ways could be fairly similar to like you could slot it right into the educational game space of like if someone's doing a like history of Antarctic exploration, like you could slide this game right in there and be like, you've done research about this, like now play this game and help use it to like catalyze all the things that you've learned about the environment and like the history and culture of the time and all of that. And also at the end of the day, it's still also a game about like colonialism and toxic masculinity and like these other pieces, but it doesn't say that on the box, right? Like that kind of comes out through the play experience and in the subtext.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And also, I do want to say I have that game on my shelf right now. It is amazing. I really want to play it. But yeah, Keith, I saw you briefly unmute. Did you want to hop in?
Yeah, I feel like the like difference. I had like an argument kind of recently with someone about the difference between craft and art. And I think it's because both of them are nebulous ideas, and also craft is often treated like crap by artists. Um, like it's sort of like the an insult of art that you don't like is that it's well crafted but not artistic or whatever. Um,
Mm,
and and yeah, they're like there's like a huge amounts of overlap between them. Like I don't think you can do a lot of good art. There's a lot of art that requires craft, like so much craftsmanship, um, that that it would be impossible without it being that as well. And I was thinking, like, because I'm like also a poet. I'm thinking about a lot of this stuff in those terms as well, because one of the differences. this is a book that expresses passion, but it's interesting because again, sort of rhetorically, one of the ways that it validates video games is not just that they're artistic, but also that they make money. Like I actually think that's part
Mm,
of they're not making games that people play and then they can't live off of them, even though that's the majority of all video games ever made. Um, are like games that like bankrupted people or never made any money. They're making things that are like financially viable and like comparing that to like in the world of poetry in which no poet is financially viable. They have to have day jobs, and telling the story of poetry would be a different story because it would be unrealistic to ever show someone be successful in a way that they lived off of it and could start a company and all these different things. Um, and and when I talk about poetry, well, like when I'm teaching it, one of the things one of the ways I feel like one way that I have defined the difference between art and other like artists and other kinds of people who make things. I think definitions are always arbitrary, so it's not like a hard and fast thing that I believe, but I think it's sometimes useful. Is I feel like artists often like create audiences or don't care about audience, um,
mm,
at least like not fully. And then other kinds of things like entertainers and so on. They have like an audience that they're shooting for, and so they're like making things that have to fit certain like roles or models or so on, um, because they're like and part of the reason for that is like artists either know that they're not going to make money or it's sort of like an all or nothing endeavor. They're like, maybe one day I'll make money doing this. But it's like more rare that like a craftsperson's like, I'm gonna, you know, I'm getting into this even though I'm never gonna make money making all this stuff. Like maybe less rare now because every industry is a nightmare. But once upon a time, the reason you got into craftsmanship was that you were gonna make a living off doing that thing. Um, and this is a book like the book is so interested in having it both ways of like having people who are artistic but are rewarded for that in a way that like I said is just like not always true. That's one of the things that
mm.
makes it romantic.
Yeah, I totally agree. Um, yeah, my brain is getting stuck on the word romantic because that's also really interesting to me. But I did want to say first that um, I attended a talk by this interesting lab. It's like a game lab called Field Day. It's affiliated with University of Wisconsin-Madison, um, and they describe themselves as we're Field Day. We make learning games. We design games that bring contemporary research to the public, and we use the game data to understand how people learn. So they're kind of like, we're a learning game studio first. But the talk that I went to was from Sarah Gagnon. She's hilarious. She's such a good speaker. She's so cool. And it was about, I forget if it was I think it was specifically maintaining storytelling in games. And it was this really interesting depiction of how they balance the like vision of the narrative alongside their learning goals. So they are making games with pretty specific learning goals, just like I'm doing. But it was really about keeping keeping the narrative side in there as well and really advocating for that even through the emphasis on getting that learning goal. So that was super interesting to me. Um, they're even talking about like trying to get funding for a game idea that they had. So it was kind of like the idea came first, the expressive idea, and then they were trying to get
Mm,
funding and turn it into a learning goal. And that was so interesting to me. I think it may be, yeah, it is publicly funded through grants and broader impact projects. Um, so yeah, that's just a sort of like putting it out there. Things like this exist.
I mean, that's what my job, my game design job is grant based.
Mhm.
Yeah, we make educational games that are funded by the by government grants, which means that like my part of the game industry is like ridiculously small. Like it's like no one is ever talking about the kind of games I make. Um, we're like whether or not a project has funding has to do with how well our grant writers wrote the thing and whether researchers are able to study the games that we're making.
Mm,
Um, and it's yeah, I would say like the work that I work on often does not like I'm like fighting tooth and nail to put art into the games basically, because there's all these other things that I'm required to put into it that are going to make it bad. Basically, like
mm.
it's going to make it um, achieve things that we promised in the grant, or technically communicate an idea, but it is not going to be either fun or moving, which are two things that I wish I could do freely.
More of.
Yeah, more of those things. And they're like
Yeah.
not unrelated to learning, right? Like
Uh-huh.
people learn best when those things are also present, but um, like grant writing apparatus doesn't recognize those. So
Yeah, it was
um,
really interesting to me as we were talking earlier about how like one part of the value of the games is that they make money because it is really interesting like it's a cyclical conversation that happens over and over again in like tabletop self-publishing like tabletop games is like people like how much should you charge? How much should you be charging? Should you charge at all? And it is really interesting to see that just like the answer at the end of the day, even if you're a hobbyist like me, who like I'm not trying to make money, is that you should still be charging because the way that people value your work is just different the second that you are charging compared to if you are giving it away for free. Like if it is like pay what you want versus someone who's just charging like $3, the perception of the game that is charging $3 is much higher just because that they're charging and that just the inherent value that charging and then that if someone is paying money for your work bestows upon it because they have invested in it is really interesting.
that is super interesting because I think that there's like money is like a way. It's like a in our culture is like a way of translating the importance of something to everyone. It's sort of like
Mm-hmm.
the way that money works anyway, right? Right? Like is um, this like abstract thing that you can turn anything into the money in order to you could like buy anything with this like abstract idea, and that also like translates into um, cultural value because like in the world of poetry, because there's no money for the vast majority of people, the opposite thing sort of happens within the world of poetry. That like when people start making money, we assume it's not art. Um,
Mm.
that like Rupi Kaur, who I think there's other reasons to dislike her poetry, but like I feel like there's just like a lot of people, or even like people who are less contentious for a popular audience, like Maya Angelou. That there's just like a lot of people, or Billy Collins. There's just like a lot of poets who like think that the fact that they were able to make some money off of their work made it less artistic. But that's like I feel like that's only true of like small like small communities and the people making the thing. But among larger communities, like when you tell someone I read this book of poetry and they're like, or I played this game and they're like, oh, whatever. And then you're like, it made $1 billion. It's like
Yeah,
more
or
likely
like
that the people are like, whoa.
I got paid to have it published in a chat book or a magazine.
Yeah.
Like
And then people are like,
that suddenly has more value than if you just wrote it.
yeah. And I think it's like kind of the, like, whether or not it's the intention of the book, it's sort of the rhetoric of the book. um that like if you sort of just imagine the story being told where they made these games, it's like the same story. These two people are
Hmm.
super passionate, semi in love with one another, or like secretly in love with one another, and spend all their time making these games that they care about, and they never make any money off of any of it. um I think that would be a more interesting book personally. But it like tells a different story about whether or not you should think of video games in the way that it sort of communicates it ultimately. And I think it has to do with the popular audience, like communicating something to